Well, all right, everybody. We've now come out of chapter 10 of Daniel and that great prayer, and now we're into chapter 11, which is his final vision, and it lasts through chapter 12. Now, to understand the prophecy of chapter 11, we need a quick history lesson of Israel. Israel was called God's chosen people, but they had a history of rebelling against him. As a result, God chastened them, punishing them because of their spiritual stubbornness. God warned them many times in the scriptures if they continued in sin, they would be scattered throughout the earth. They would be weak and they would live in fear. And that happened, didn't it? It was still happening. They're still scattered throughout the world and they're still suffering to a degree. But God will turn his attention back to them after the church age. During that final 7 years we call the tribulation period, that's mainly about God dealing with the Jew again. So we have to understand this to understand the prophetic vision in Daniel 11 and 12. Now, Daniel knew that the prophet Jeremiah had said Israel would be in captivity for 70 years. Now, he thought that after 70 years came to an end, all the people in captivity would return to the Holy Land. The city of Jerusalem would be rebuilt and the temple would be restored. But only a small remnant returned when they were allowed. So they had been chastened and scattered from their homeland like God said they would. But rather than responding to that chastening and recommitting themselves to the Lord, they just sort of settled in and started enjoying the pagan life Babylon offered. They had no interest in serving God or returning to the land he had given to them. And so this was not the end of their chastening. It would continue on. But Daniel is distraught about all this, and he goes to God in prayer. That's chapter 10. I mean, why didn't the people care? Why didn't they return to rebuild the city and the temple? Plus, those who did return faced opposition, and they just stopped building. So he's mourning and fasting. He's seeking understanding. And finally, the answer comes. A heavenly messenger is sent in a vision. So in chapter 11 and 12, he gives Daniel the reason why Israel has not been restored in its land, why Jerusalem is still in ruins and the temple is not rebuilt. And the message is this: the chastening of Israel will continue until the Messiah returns. At that time, there will be a restoration between God and his chosen people. But until then, during the church age, Israel is going to continue to experience a hardening towards God. So Daniel, you thought the chastening was over at 70 years? But Israel refused to be corrected by it, so this is only the beginning. With all that said, let's dig into chapter 11, and it's going to take us a few weeks to work through all of this. There's a lot here. Look at Daniel 11, verse 1. And as for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. So the angel who was speaking to Daniel in chapter 10 continues here, and like we saw last week, we believe this is Gabriel. Now, this verse is often considered the closing verse of chapter 10. Probably should have been there. I believe it is saying, this angel stood by Michael's side when Darius came into power. And together they worked against satanic influence, trying to turn this new kingdom now that Darius was over, from hostility to favor towards Israel. And if you remember in chapter 6, there were efforts made in the first year of Darius' reign to make him hostile towards Daniel and Israel. And the result was the lion's den, but God sent his angel to shut the lion's mouth. And that miraculous deliverance by that angel caused Darius to favor Israel. So what might be happening here is this angel is the one who shut the lion's mouth and turned Darius' heart to favor Daniel and advance Israel's cause. And remember his decree after the lion's den? Daniel 6:25 through 28. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So it seems the angel gives Daniel a bit of history, telling him what he was involved in. Now the angel begins to reveal the revelation of the future. And this is the last revelation in this book, and it's disturbing. It reveals the suffering the people of Israel will endure until the tribulation period. So from chapter 11, verse 2 to the end of chapter 12, we have the flow of history focused on Israel. And in chapter 11, rather than being restored to a great nation, they will be surrounded by great nations that will continue to dominate them. And the accuracy of this vision is so remarkable, and history verifies it at every point. But the accuracy of the Bible shouldn't surprise us, should it? If we realize God is the author. 2 Peter 1:21 says, "For no prophecy was ever produced by the will of man, but men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit." So it should be no surprise that this vision is spot on, that history happened just like it said it would. God, the one who knows the beginning from the end, is the author. But this is why so many people have problems with the Bible. They confuse us. They confuse who the author is. Seminaries today are teaching the Bible is just a compilation of man's religious thought. Then those men are put into pulpits, not because they are spiritual, but because they have a degree, a piece of worthless paper in their case. And then they begin to spew out their doubts about the Bible to the congregation. And since it is merely man's thoughts, it has errors in it, so it can't be trusted. Oh yeah, it's a nice little book filled with some warm thoughts, some religious thoughts, but you can't trust it to guide your life. And so the lie leaps from the seminary to the pulpit, then to the pew. Now, with that said, let's dig into the events in this vision, and we'll see how far we can get. There's so much here. We have a succession of kings we must work through. And so, you know what? It's going to take a few weeks, I think. And one might wonder why this is here at all this history. Because it proves history is his story. God is in control. So things happen exactly like he said they would. This accuracy then proves the Bible is God's book that we can trust. So let's begin with the Persian kings. That's Daniel 11:2. "And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece." So there will be 3 kings who arise in Persia, followed by a 4th. The 4th will try to stand up against the great Grecian Empire. Now, because of time, we'll concentrate on the 4th king, who is Xerxes. And we find Xerxes mentioned in the book of Esther. He was one of the greatest Oriental rulers of all time. He had extraordinary wealth and commanded the largest army in the ancient world. Now, because of this, he decided that he would attack Greece. But Greece was too strong and defeated him in a devastating, humiliating way. And you know what? The Greeks never forgot what Xerxes did when he attacked them. I mean, how dare he? So some 150 years later, they decided to retaliate. I mean, that's holding a grudge, isn't it? The Greek armies were led by Alexander the Great. Now, he's mentioned in verse 3. Let's look at that. Daniel 11:3. "Then a mighty king shall arise who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills." And we know from Daniel's earlier visions, following the Medo-Persian Empire came the Greeks. And there is no doubt this is Alexander. He seized the Persian Empire and enjoyed incredible dominion. He was one of the greatest military leaders the world has ever seen, and his rule was absolute. It says he did whatever he wanted to do. He did as he willed. Now, the Persians before and the Greeks under Alexander possessed the land of Israel and controlled it. But notice what happened in verse 4, Daniel 11:4. "And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these." And so Alexander ruled absolutely, but he died early at the age of 33. And it says, as soon as he had arisen. So it seems as soon as he got this amazing kingdom, then it was broken. And it was divided toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now remember, this prophecy was made a few hundred years before Alexander was born. Now he had 3 relatives the kingdom could have gone to, but they were all murdered. So the angel was right. The kingdom did not go to his posterity. It was thrown to the 4 winds. And a great battle for the crown ensued that was won by 4 generals who divided the kingdom. Cassander took Macedonia, Lysimachus took Thrace and Asia Minor, Ptolemy took Egypt, and Seleucus eventually took Syria. So 4 kingdoms sprung up, but none were as powerful as Alexander, just like the angel said. Now 2 kingdoms become the focus of the rest of this chapter. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt to the south of Israel. Now Israel's a reference point here. And then the Seleucid dynasty in Syria to the north of Israel. And these 2 empires warred with each other for centuries. And guess where they fought those wars? On the soil of the middleman, Israel. So Israel was dominated by whoever of these 2 won the most recent war. The stronger of the 2 always held dominion over the Holy Land. So, Daniel, you're frustrated because Israel hasn't become great again? Well, they won't at this time. They are being chastened, dominated by foreign powers. Now, let's look at the king of the south. That's in verse 5. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. So the king of the south, that's the Ptolemies in Egypt. They shall be strong. But here we see how Seleucus rose to power in the north, in Syria. Ptolemy I was the strong king to the south, but Seleucus was his prince who rose to power, and his alliance with Ptolemy enabled him to seize the throne of Syria to the north. Now we move to the next set of kings. That's Daniel 11:6. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her and he who supported her in those times. So it seems like these 2 empires, to the north and to the south, they grew tired of the constant tension and fighting. So the Ptolemies and the Seleucids decided to join forces, and they made an alliance for a time. The 2 families were joined by a marriage between Antiochus II of the Seleucids and Berenice, the daughter of Ptolemy II. But to marry Berenice, Ptolemy insisted Antiochus divorce his wife, Laodice, which he did. Now this brought about peace between the 2 kingdoms for a while, until Ptolemy II died. So let's try to put together the last part of this verse. Speaking of Berenice, it says, but she shall not retain the strength of her arm. In other words, her strength won't last. When Ptolemy II died, Antiochus II put away Berenice and took back his former wife, Laodice. But watch what happens to Antiochus, and he and his arm shall not endure. His power won't last. So Laodice didn't trust Antiochus II and had him poisoned. Now back to Berenice, but she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her and he who supported her in those times. So after murdering Antiochus, Laodice had Berenice, her son, and attendants killed. I mean, what a sweet family, right? I wonder if there's a Hallmark card for that. So after the carnage, Laodice set her son Seleucus II on the throne of Syria. And that moves us to the next kings. Ptolemy III are Euergetes, and Seleucus II are Callinicus. Look at Daniel 11:7 and 8. And from a branch from her roots, one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. So Berenice's brother, Ptolemy III, becomes the new king of Egypt. That's the branch from her root. And he was intent on defending his sister's honor and avenging her death. So he attacked the northern power in Syria and won the victory and collected a great deal of wealth. Now, after his victory, he had no desire to fight anymore. He had no desire to attack the north, so there was peace for years. But now Seleucus in the north is mad, so he attacks the south in 240 BC. That's verse 9. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. So the northern king was defeated in the south and returned home in shame, where he was killed by a fall from his horse. His son Seleucus III then took the throne, only to be assassinated 4 years later, and he was followed by Antiochus III, the Great, who ruled from 223 to 187. And again, remember, Israel is sitting right in between all this, dominated by these two powers. Now, verses 10 through 20 tell us how the battle seesawed between the north and the south. And we see the sons of the king of the north in verse 10. His sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. So the sons of the king of the north, that's Syria, would continue the battles. And one of them would conquer the Holy Land, overflow and pass through. This was Antiochus III, who assembled a great army. And he took back the Holy Land from the dominion of the Ptolemies. Now, of course, this infuriated the king of the south. Are you keeping up? Look at verse 11 and 12. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north, and he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. And so the king of the south attacks the king of the north and his great multitude of soldiers. Now the king of the north had 73,000 men, 5,000 cavalry, and 73 elephants. Now elephants were a big deal. They were like tanks. They were used as battering rams, and they were used to carry provisions. So the king of the south prevails over this massive army, but is lifted up in pride. It says he shall not prevail. In other words, their advantage from the victory was brief. This just made the north angry. So here they come again. Look at verse 13. For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. So just like the angel said, 13 years later, Antiochus returned to get his revenge with a greater army than he had before and with abundant supplies. Now look who joins the king of the north. The violent, it says, and this is an interesting group, Daniel 11:14. In those times many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. And so the king of the south is hated, and many rise up against him, including the violent among your own people. These were Jews who wanted independence from the southern king who was in control of the Holy Land at the time. And so they joined the north in their fight. And some believe they were trying to get in good with the king of the north, Antiochus, thinking if they fought with him, they would gain favor and hopefully gain their freedom. But it says they failed. He didn't give them what they had hoped to get. Now, verse 15 and 16 is important. It tells us what happened when the king of the north attacked the south. Look at verse 15. Then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. And so the king of the north completely routs the south. Now notice what it says. Again, this is Antiochus the Great. Look at verse 16. But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. The glorious land, that's Israel, isn't it? Who was dominated by Antiochus and the Syrian power from the north. And so they helped them win the victory, but they didn't get what they wanted. They're now under Syrian control. So Daniel 11:17 says, he shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom. Antiochus III was ruling over the Holy Land at this time. But here it says he sets his heart on dominating the king of the south. Look at verse 17. And he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom. So one way Antiochus tried to control the south was through an alliance. And he offered his daughter Cleopatra, no, not that Cleopatra, to Ptolemy V in marriage to seal the deal. This was supposedly an act to show Ptolemy he could trust him. But in reality, he was trying to gain influence in the south through his daughter, but it didn't work. She loved her husband more than her father, so that plan failed. Look at verse 17 again. But it shall not stand or be to his advantage. Now again, why does God put all this in the Bible? Remember, it shows that God knows history before it happens, and it also shows God is in control of what happens. This happens like he said it would because God is sovereign and he is controlling it. Now, Antiochus makes a great tactical mistake. Look at verse 18. Afterward, he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. And so he decides to go to the coastlands. But this is where Rome is in control. And he did succeed a bit. He captured some of the coastland. But it says, but a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. So he eventually failed because Claudius Scipio, a Roman commander, defeated him. Again, the accuracy of this verse, written long before the events, is amazing. Not only foretelling Antiochus' defeat of Egypt, his agreement with Syria, then turning his face to the coastlands, and his defeat by this Roman commander. Then in verse 19, we see another mistake from Antiochus. Look at verse 19. Then he shall turn his face back toward the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. So after his defeat by Rome, he returned home. And in need of finances, he resorted to pillaging a temple in his own land to steal the treasure. And the people got so mad they murdered him on the spot. So he wasn't found anymore. Then look at verse 20. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. In other words, the one who replaced him was an exactor of tribute. He raised taxes. This was Seleucus III, the eldest son of Antiochus III. So to increase revenue, the kingdom was broke, causing Antiochus to plunder the temple. Seleucus decided to plunder the people. Daniel 11:20 again, but within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. So Seleucus was assassinated, probably by his brother. Well, let's conclude this. I think we've gone far enough. We've gone through all these kings, and we've seen the battles that raged back and forth, with Israel being the pawn stuck in the middle. And now that brings us next week to an extremely evil man who we saw before, referred to as the Antichrist of the Old Testament, Antiochus Epiphanes. And we'll see more about his rise into power. So what did we see this week? We saw the chastisement of Israel continuing, dominated by foreign powers, and we saw the amazing accuracy of Scripture verified by history. Next week, we'll pick this up again, seeing Antiochus Epiphanes. So guys, thank you for hanging out this long with me. I appreciate all of you who watch the videos and share them out. That really helps us. I appreciate you, those of you who hit the like, the subscribe, the notify bell. That helps us out a lot. And I appreciate those of you who are beginning to support the channel. That really helps us out so that we can continue to do what we're doing here, getting the truth of God out. And if you're interested, the links on how to support us, they're in the description area. All right, so God bless you guys. I love you, and I'll see you in the next video.